At the dawn of the 20th century, as the world stood on the brink of an unprecedented conflict, Great Britain remained a country whose life still relied heavily on horsepower. In 1914, despite the appearance of the first smoky motor cars, horses still dominated roads, fields, and industry. They pulled plows that fed the nation, hauled goods and raw materials between towns, and powered omnibuses and cabs in growing metropolises. This familiar, century-old way of life was about to change forever with the first shots of the Great War. When Britain declared war on Germany, the Secretary of State for War, Lord Kitchener, issued his famous call for volunteers. His stern gaze on posters, finger pointed at civilians, urged men to join the ranks. But the public did not immediately realize that Kitchener needed more than men. The British Army in peacetime was catastrophically unprepared for the logistical challenges of continental war. In 1914, its equine stock was pitiful, only about 26,000 animals. That number was utterly inadequate for mobilization. Horsepower was critically important for every branch of service without exception. Cavalry needed thousands of light, fast horses for reconnaissance and flanking attacks. Artillery, Royal Horse Artillery and Royal Field Artillery, was wholly dependent on strong, hardy animals capable of dragging heavy guns and ammunition chests across impassable terrain. Transport and supply, Army Service Corps, required innumerable draft horses and wagons to move ammunition, rations, water, medical supplies, and engineering stores from railway depots to the front lines. Recognizing this deficit, the Army immediately activated a plan of mass requisition. At least another 100,000 horses were needed, and they had to be found at once. Officers, purchasers, and veterinary surgeons were dispatched across the country. Their task was to comb every town, village, and farm. Thanks to pre-existing winter census records compiled by the police, the Army had reasonably accurate data on where and what types of horses were kept. Armed with that information, military teams went out to farms, businesses, and omnibus depots. If an animal passed inspection and a price was agreed, it was taken straight to Army remount depots, where its new life as a service horse began. The scale of the operation was staggering. Within 2 weeks, the Army had collected around 140,000 horses. This lightning requisition policy saved Army logistics but devastated civilian life. For businesses across the country, it was a catastrophe. For many ordinary people forced to give up their beasts, it was a personal tragedy. Len Whitehead, who grew up on a Suffolk farm, recalled the experience with pain. His family owned only 4 horses. 2 of them, fine Shire draughts, and a young mare, were taken. The family was left with a single horse. For young Len, who cried that night, it was an emotional shock. He had lost animals he knew by name, Duke and Violet, who were not merely working stock, but members of the family. Warrior, the volunteer mount. Not all horses went to war by force. Some went to war voluntarily, following their owners. The most famous of them was a horse named Warrior. His owner was Jack Seeley, a wealthy member of the cabinet and an experienced rider nicknamed Galloper Jack from his Boer War service. When Seeley volunteered for the front in 1914, he took his favorite mount with him. Warrior was not an ordinary horse. He was a thoroughbred with a high spirit and stamina unlike that of common draft horses. Smallish in stature, 15.2 hands, but sturdy and powerful, he was ideal for a cavalryman. Even before the war, Warrior showed an extraordinary character. Seeley liked riding the chalk hills around the family estate on the Isle of Wight. There he deliberately exposed the horse to stress. He recalled teaching Warrior not to fear the sea. Whereas most horses shy away from breaking waves, Seeley made Warrior step into the surf until the waves broke against his chest. He wrote, "I felt him trembling beneath me, but he was determined to conquer his fear." It was then that Seeley first realized how remarkable and brave his animal was. That trait, the ability to overcome fear, became warriors' hallmark and later legendary on the battlefields of the Western Front. Glamour and grime, enlistment into the cavalry. Jack Seeley and Warrior were to join the cavalry, an elite branch of the British Army whose famed history attracted countless volunteers. Yet many of Kitchener's new recruits came from towns and had never sat a horse in their lives. They joined the cavalry because it looked far more glamorous than the infantry. That impression was false. In reality, they faced grueling, exhausting, and brutal work. The Army's method of horsemanship was swift and severe. Fall until you learn. 17-year-old Smiler Marshall, who volunteered for the Essex Yeomanry, recalled the experience. Recruits were forced to ride without saddle or bridle, holding small sticks under their arms. When the instructor gave the word, they had to stay on. Marshall remembered clinging to a horse's neck as others fell, while the sergeant shouted, "Who the hell told you to dismount?" Kitchener's new army would soon join the regular forces on the Western Front, but neither the experienced cavalrymen nor the city lads nor the farm-requisitioned horses and nags imagined that the face of modern war had already changed forever. Cold steel versus firepower, tactics and armament. The elite cavalry regiments marching to the ports in August 1914 made a spectacular sight. They embodied military tradition, the airs of Waterloo and Balaclava. Their armament reflected that double nature, an attempt to marry tradition with the demands of modernity. The principal weapon for shock remained the sword. The 1908 pattern sword issued to British cavalrymen was the pinnacle of contemporary cold weapon design. It was a weapon conceived with one brutal purpose: to pierce. Unlike the hacking sabers of earlier wars, this sword had an absolutely straight, narrow blade. The idea was that a rider at full gallop could give point. The mass of the horse, around 500 kilograms, and the speed, up to 30 miles per hour, turned that thrust into a devastating blow, capable of penetrating greatcoats and kit and inflicting a mortal wound. It was a perfected weapon for cavalry shock. But, contrary to the popular myth, British cavalry in 1914 were not merely a crowd of riders with swords. They were also armed with the short-breech Lee Enfield rifles, among the best rifles of the age, notable for rapid fire. British doctrine trained cavalrymen as versatile soldiers, to dismount, pass horses to handlers, and fight on foot with the same precision as infantry. Tactically, command envisioned their role much like modern paratroopers or motorized infantry, a mobile, reactive force capable of covering large distances quickly, seizing key points, bridges, crossroads, and holding them until main infantry forces arrived. They could fight mounted or on foot. This combination of a modern rifle and an archaic sword symbolized an army with one foot in the 19th century and the other trying to step into the 20th. None of them could imagine the horrors that lay ahead for the animals requisitioned from peaceful farms and stables across the country. The crossing, a logistical nightmare. The first ordeal for these horses was not battle, but the journey to France. Most had never seen the sea, let alone a ship. Historian Richard Van Emden, tracing their route to the Western Front, describes scenes of organized chaos. Even reaching the harbor was enormously stressful for the animals. They had to be driven on board, and many panicked at the narrow ramps. Soldiers had to haul and shove them, and at times even use winches and special slings to literally hoist a horse and lower it into the Holt. It was an infernal process. Van Emden relates one especially tragic story of a horse that suddenly lost control on deck, tore free, and leapt overboard. The troops watched in sorrow as the ship pulled away and the horse swam desperately in the sea, trying to catch up until it slowly disappeared from sight. For those that survived the crossing, the hazards of the voyage were only a foretaste of the horrors to come. Within days of arriving on the continent, they had their first experience of combat, and it was nothing like the peaceful fields and cobbled streets of England. The first shock, collision with reality. Horses are extraordinarily sensitive and reactive animals. There was no way to prepare them for what awaited them. The stress of long transport, endless hours in harness hauling heavy loads, and above all, the sights and sounds of war. They were shelled and bombed. They suffered from cold, hunger, and exhaustion. This was a life they had never known and could not comprehend. Yet, as early as August 1914, during the chaotic retreat from Belgium, some animals began to display astonishing endurance. Warrior, General Jack Seeley's horse, was already showing his legendary courage. Seeley describes riding past burning stables in a village when a whole bouquet of artillery shells burst nearby. One detonated only a few yards away. To the general's surprise, Warrior didn't even try to bolt. "I felt him trembling beneath me," Seeley wrote, "but he pretended not to be disturbed at all. He tried to be brave and succeeded." That trait, the ability to stand under fire without panic, became his hallmark. His composure, of course, bolstered the courage of everyone around him. The charge at Audregnies, the bloody reality of a cavalry assault. By 23 August 1914, the British Expeditionary Force, BEF, was fighting desperate rearguard actions, falling back south under pressure from numerically superior German forces. As the exhausted infantry withdrew, the cavalry acted as a shield, engaging and delaying German infantry wherever possible. It was in this defensive role that 3 regiments of hussars and lancers were drawn into one of the bloodiest cavalry attacks of the war, near the French village of Audregnies. On 24 August, the situation became critical. At least 10 and possibly 20,000 German infantry were preparing to leave the village and strike the British flank. Only 2 British battalions stood in their way, facing annihilation. A desperate decision was made. 3 cavalry regiments would attack. The problem was that the troopers arrived on position already wound up, ready for action. The brigadier ordered them to delay the Germans at all costs, adding the fatal phrase, "You may have to attack them." For men hungry for battle, it was a red rag to a bull. They burst out of the village straight toward the German positions, but after galloping about a mile, they realized the Germans were much farther away than they had seemed. As the horses began to tire, the advancing cavalry met a storm of artillery and machine gun fire. Hell began. Men and horses took heavy losses. Shells erupted across the fields in a deafening cacophony. Rifle and machine gun fire scythed the ranks. Troopers tumbled from the saddle. It was utter chaos. Veterans recalled that their mounts were completely unmanageable. They simply clung on while bullets hissed and explosions crashed around them. It was their first experience under such fire. They couldn't stop, had no idea where they were riding, and comrades were falling all around them. It was a horrific ordeal. Later, artists, eager to satisfy the public's appetite for heroism, painted the charge as a glorious victory. On the canvases, British cavalry vaulted German guns and skewered enemy soldiers. But it was all untrue. In reality, none of the cavalry got within 600 yards of the guns. In just 10 minutes, the 3 regiments lost around 250 men killed, wounded, and captured. The attack delivered a bitter lesson. In the face of modern machine gun warfare, there was no room for brave but futile gestures. Generals still believed cavalry had a role, but it was now obvious that it had to be employed with far greater tactical intelligence. The end of maneuver, a horseman in the mud. The fiasco at Audregnies was a portent. After the initial chaotic maneuvering, the series of flanking moves and countermoves, known as the Race to the Sea, the opposing armies finally exhausted themselves. By the winter of 1914, the front had solidified. Along the Western Front, from the Channel to the Swiss border, there rose a vast system of field fortifications, trenches, dugouts, and barbed wire. The war took on a new, eerie, subterranean character. For the proud cavalry regiments, it was a catastrophe. The open space essential to their existence vanished, swallowed by miles of churned earth and machine gun nests. Horses and riders trained for swift raids found themselves trapped in a positional deadlock. Command reached the only possible decision. The cavalrymen would dismount and fight as infantry. For men who considered themselves the elite, it was a profound shock. Smiler Marshall, the Essex lad who had joined the yeomanry in search of glory, described his first impression of the trenches with disgust. Mud, slugs, everything was horrible. All the time you wondered if you'd be the next killed. The experience deeply scarred the cavalrymen. They had to leave their horses in rear-area stables, often improvised and unsafe, and head into the mire where their training and status counted for nothing. They became ordinary cannon fodder, like the infantry they had once been meant to protect. The psychological gulf between the glittering parade of August and the rotting trench of December was colossal. The logistic backbone, a 98% army. While cavalry as a combat arm suffered an identity crisis, the horse's role in the war paradoxically did not shrink, it grew exponentially. In the public mind, the war of horses means cavalry. The reality was different. Military historian Andy Robertshaw stresses a striking fact. Only 2% of the Army's horses belonged to the cavalry. The remaining 98% were transport animals. These were the millions of horses and mules that formed the logistic backbone of the entire British Army. As the Army swelled and its needs for shells, food, and ammunition reached astronomical levels, the role of these animals became absolutely indispensable. You could say it was impossible to wage war without horses, Robertshaw notes. There were very few motor vehicles. Practically everything was hauled by horses. This 98% was an invisible army performing titanic labor. Draft horses, huge muscular animals such as Shires, Clydesdales, and Percherons, living tractors moving thousands of tons of supplies. Pack horses and mules, smaller but incredibly hardy animals, able to carry loads along narrow trench paths and shattered terrain where even wagons could not go. These animals became the true laborers of the war, and their importance only grew with every major offensive. Working giants, the war's transit vans. Public attention fixated on the thoroughbreds of the cavalry, but the real heroes of logistics were the heavy draft horses. Meeting modern descendants of these animals, former RSPCA Chief Vet Mark Evans and historian Andy Robertshaw analyzed their role. These were not elegant racers. They were, as the saying goes, built like brick barns. Vast, thick set, with incredibly powerful hind quarters and back muscles. These living engines were made for one purpose, hauling massive weight for hours on end. The standard general service wagon was essentially the equivalent of an off-road delivery van. It could carry 1.5 tons of cargo. For fighting the war, these wagons were critical. It's better than a Land Rover, Robertshaw explains. It's more like the First World War's transit van, and it can go off-road. Without horses, nothing moved. Without movement, there could be no war. Roads of death, the danger of supply arteries. But the route these horses and their drivers took to the front line was itself a battlefield. A convoy of slow, clattering wagons strung out along a road made an incredibly visible and vulnerable target on the horizon. German artillery understood this perfectly. Even if they could not see a convoy directly, they knew the key supply routes, bridges, crossroads, village entrances, and routinely shelled them on spec. This was harassing fire. Gunners simply set fuses and every half hour plastered a given stretch of road, knowing they would hit someone sooner or later. This turned a routine run for ammunition into a horrific lottery. When a shell landed in a column of wagons, it was hell. The consequences were dreadful. Explosions tore into not only men and cargo, but also the large, panicking animals harnessed to the traces. Perhaps the most dangerous stretch of road on the entire Western Front was a junction on the main supply line into the Belgian city of Ypres. Soldiers gave it a grim name, Hellfire Corner. It was an open, low-lying crossroads perfectly observed by German spotters on surrounding heights. To conceal movement, British engineers strung burlap screens along the road, but the Germans still regularly hosed the junction with devastating fire. Men and horses risked their lives crossing this section, often at full gallop, trying to dash through between the bursts. Alfred Henn, a driver with the Warwickshire Royal Horse Artillery, narrowly escaped death on such a stretch when the team hauling his wagon simply stopped in the middle of the road under fire. They stood stock still. They didn't want to move. Everyone else went by and left me alone in the road, he recalled. He jumped down, trying to pull them back. He thought it was the end. Just in time, I thought now they'll get a shell. And a shell did hit. One exploded right behind the wagon. The blast wounded the horses and flung Henn himself aside, but miraculously he survived, clinging to a fence. It was pure luck. Even after such nerve-shredding trips, a driver's day did not end. Before he could rest, he had to care for his horses. City boys and army routine. Caring for horses is hard, dirty, unending work even in peacetime. In war, amid mud, under constant shelling, with limited resources, it became Herculean. And it fell on the shoulders of men utterly unprepared for it. Most of the young men who became drivers and gunners were city lads. They came from industrial centers, Leeds, Bradford, Birmingham, London. Many had perhaps never touched a horse before the war. Suddenly, they were responsible for the lives and health of 2 or more huge animals on which, in turn, their own survival depended. The evening ritual was immutable. After a long, dangerous haul, an exhausted soldier had no right to rest until his horses were cared for. That was priority number 1. Bill Cotgrove, a Londoner and a driver in the Royal Field Artillery, remembered the rule with absolute clarity. You had to see your horses were all right. They were your main concern. We had to feed them properly. He recalled scraping the caked mud from his horse's coat and making sure the animal was dry and fed before thinking of himself. The routine included feeding and watering, supplying forage and clean water, itself a huge logistic problem. Grooming, removing mud, sweat, and parasites, vital to prevent skin diseases such as mud fever. Inspection, checking legs, hooves, and back for wounds, harness sores, or stones lodged in the hoof. For men who had never done it, this was a complex craft. The Blue Cross Handbook, How to Handle a Horse. Recognizing this knowledge gap, animal charities such as the RSPCA and Blue Cross stepped in. The public donated generously, and these organizations provided practical help, building veterinary hospitals in the rear and sending medicines and equipment. But perhaps their most important contribution was educational. Blue Cross published a small, invaluable booklet, the Driver's, Gunner's, and Mounted Soldier's Handbook. It was essentially a Horses for Dummies guide, written in plain language, a pocket-sized, step-by-step manual that fit in every soldier's greatcoat. It explained the absolute basics: how to fit harness correctly, how to spot lameness, how to clean hooves. This little book was a lifesaver for thousands of soldiers who had no idea what they were doing. Its value at the front is hard to overstate. A therapeutic bond, responsibility, and solace. The exhausting duty of daily care in inhuman conditions had an unexpected psychological effect. It created a bond. These young soldiers were frightened. They lived in a state of constant, inescapable fear of death. In that chaos, a horse became an anchor. Having something living for which you bore personal responsibility gave immense self-control. The horse became a silent companion you could trust. A soldier could approach his horse, stroke it, tell it his troubles, embrace it. That small tenderness was essential for both animal and man. It gave the soldier a sense of purpose beyond mere survival or killing. It was therapy in its purest form. This bond was so important that the Blue Cross Handbook included advice that seems more emotional than practical today. One instruction read, "When a horse is tired or cold, tug his ears and rub his legs with your hands. It refreshes him, and he will appreciate it." It's a touching detail. Tug the ears is not just a technique, it's a gesture of affection. The authors understood that an animal's emotional state mattered as much as its physical condition, and that this bond was key to their shared survival. Symbol and talisman, the general and his warrior. For the ordinary soldier, this bond was private and quiet. For some, it became a public symbol. The connection between General Jack Seeley and his horse Warrior needed no handbook. They were inseparable. Warrior stayed with the general and followed him everywhere. At times, witnesses recalled he would simply trail after Seeley like a dog. When Seeley took command of the Canadian Cavalry Brigade, the men were so impressed by Warrior and his legendary steadiness under fire that they unofficially adopted him as the brigade's mascot. It changed the dynamic between the general and his men. When they saw Seeley on Warrior, they saluted not the general, they saluted the horse. They could walk up, pat Warrior on the neck or rump, and the horse stood, proudly accepting the attention. They could not clap the general on the back, but they could clap his horse, forging a unique connection. They would shout, "Here comes Warrior." If Warrior was there, all would be well. The horse became a symbol. As Seeley himself wrote, Warrior was his passport, wherever he went. The fellow in the red cap with that thoroughbred under him. In 1916, Seeley, astride his beloved mount, joined one of the greatest gatherings of men and horses the world had ever seen. A reformed cavalry, Warrior among them, was preparing for its sternest test, the Battle of the Somme. New doctrine and an old dream, preparing for the big push. After a year and a half of grinding positional warfare that turned the fields of Flanders and France into a vast swamp of trenches, the Allied High Command desperately sought a way to restore maneuver. The British Commander-in-Chief, Sir Douglas Haig, was himself a cavalryman, and, despite the bloody lessons of 1914, sincerely believed in the decisive role of mounted troops. To this end, a vast force was assembled behind the lines. 50,000 horsemen, entire cavalry divisions from Britain and the Empire, were concentrated in the rear, ready for the big push. The week of waiting. Cavalry on the starting line. By the evening of June 30, 1916, the cavalry regiments had taken their final positions along a 25-mile stretch of the front north of the River Somme. For the past week, they had listened to an unending roar. More than 1.5 million shells fired by British artillery into the German lines. This bombardment, it was believed, would annihilate everything alive. Historian Richard van Emden paints a picture of surreal anticipation. We are used to imagining infantrymen huddled in the trenches of the Somme, but we forget about another army standing behind them. We are less familiar with the idea that 5 miles behind were thousands of horses, ready to move. The British cavalry regiments poised to pour through the fields should any significant gap appear in the German line. It was perhaps one of the last grand and tragic spectacles of the Old War. The elite of the British Army, armed to the teeth, Indian Bengal Lancers, Canadian Dragoons, British Hussars and Lancers, rifles in their scabbards, swords sharpened, lances with pennons fluttering, a vision from another age, men eager for combat, waiting only for the order. Among those waiting was the Canadian Cavalry, led by General Jack Seeley and his horse, Warrior. On July 1, 1916, they stood directly behind the front line. Seeley recalled lying on the ground, holding Warrior's reins while British shells howled overhead. They expected that any moment he would leap into the saddle and lead the charge through the breach to encircle the Germans. And Warrior, as always, was ready. Seeley felt that although the horse was nervous, he was determined to move forward, not back, an animal that sensed the tension but was prepared for action. July 1, 1916. Disaster. What happened next became the darkest day in British military history. The artillery bombardment failed. The shells had not destroyed the deep German bunkers or the dense belts of barbed wire. When the infantry climbed from their trenches, they were met by intact German machine guns. Nearly 20,000 men were killed in just a few hours. The expected breakthrough never came. The front didn't collapse. It became a gigantic meat grinder. And behind it, 5 miles from the inferno, 50,000 cavalrymen and their horses kept waiting. They waited for an order that never came. At 3 p.m. came the command, "Stand down." The cavalry was to withdraw. They were not needed. The frustration of the dead season. This pattern repeated itself again and again throughout the bloody Battle of the Somme, which dragged on until November 1916. The cavalry was repeatedly brought to full readiness, moved up to forward positions before every new attack, and every time the assault collapsed in blood, they were pulled back. This cycle of tension raised to the boiling point and then nothing was exhausting and demoralizing. One officer captured the feeling perfectly. It was as if you had gone to the races for a week, but never once reached the track. Those months on the Somme were fruitless, but not bloodless. As the army counted horrific infantry losses at the front, it also began to tally casualties behind the lines. The huge concentration of men and horses waiting in reserve made a perfect target for German long-range artillery and air attacks. Horses died by the hundreds without ever entering battle. Victims of stray shells, disease, and exhaustion in the makeshift rear camps. The Battle of the Somme cost the army dearly in horses, but more importantly, it buried once and for all the dream of a classic cavalry breakthrough. Winter 1916 to 1917, a new enemy. The men and horses who survived the Somme's carnage now faced an enemy no weapon could defeat: the weather. The winter of 1916 to 1917 was one of the harshest of the entire war. When the failed Somme offensive finally sputtered out in November, the armies were trapped in horrific conditions. Temperatures plunged. For men and animals forced to exist in a shattered, waterlogged landscape, survival became a slow torment. Life dwindled into mere endurance. Ironically, most horses did not die from shells. The majority of deaths, by some estimates over 60 to 70%, came from exhaustion, disease, and exposure. Endless labor, constant cold, and poor quality fodder killed them by the thousands. They simply collapsed in their traces and did not rise again. The Army Veterinary Corps, a battle for life. Amid these colossal non-combat losses, the role of the Army Veterinary Corps became absolutely vital. Without their work, the Army's horse force would cease to exist, leading to a total logistical collapse and, likely, defeat. The scale of their effort was astounding. During the war, the Corps treated 2.5 million animals, a vast medical operation. 20 specialized horse hospitals were built in the rear. These were not makeshift shelters, but large, well-organized medical centers. Mark Evans, visiting a modern Army veterinary center, reflected on the challenges his counterparts faced a century earlier. What problems did they confront daily? Exhaustion, from relentless labor and chronic lack of calories and water. Leg injuries, from nails, debris, and mud. Mud fever, a chronic bacterial skin infection caused by constant wetness. Shrapnel and bullet wounds, from artillery and air attacks on rear areas. Mange, a highly contagious parasitic skin disease that spread rapidly in overcrowded stables. Their resources were primitive by modern standards. Penicillin had not yet been discovered. It would appear only in 1928. They had no antibiotics, yet they were astonishingly resourceful. To treat infected wounds, they used continuous drip irrigation with mild antiseptic solutions. Wounds were constantly washed, mechanically flushing out dirt and bacteria, and the method proved remarkably effective. They also had anesthetics such as chloroform, allowing complex surgeries to be performed humanely. The AVC success was extraordinary. Over 80% of animals admitted to hospitals recovered and returned to service. This figure stands as a testament to professionalism and dedication. It was the veterinarians and their assistants who kept the British Army's living engine running. No foot, no horse, the treacherous caltrop. Beyond disease and fatigue, there was another, subtler but deadly threat, a weapon designed specifically against horses. This was the caltrop, a small but devilish device, a piece of metal with 4 sharp spikes arranged so that one always pointed upward. As they retreated, the Germans scattered these devil's teeth across roads, fords, and fields, hoping to cripple the British horses pursuing them. Hidden in puddles or mud, invisible to a galloping animal, the spike would pierce deep into the hoof. The result was catastrophic. The spike punctured the hoof's sole, passed through the fibrous digital cushion, the hoof's shock absorber, and often reached the joint. The problem wasn't just the wound. Dirt and bacteria were driven deep into the tissue, causing infections impossible to clean. An old army saying went, "No foot, no horse." Once a horse developed such an infection, its fate was sealed: euthanasia. The caltrop was simple, cheap, and lethally effective against an army dependent on horses. The Army's need for horses never diminished. By 1917, Britain's domestic supply was exhausted, forcing massive imports from abroad. Hundreds of thousands of animals, mostly from North America. Those that arrived that year would soon face the most horrific battle conditions of the entire war, the Battle of Passchendaele. Battle in the Mud, the Third Battle of Ypres. By 1917, the war had raged for 3 years and both sides were exhausted. Yet the British command was still searching for a decisive breakthrough. They pinned their hopes on the Third Battle of Ypres, intended to seize the German bases on the Belgian coast. This battle, fought from July to November 1917, would enter history under its grim final name, the Battle of Passchendaele. The very word Passchendaele became synonymous not merely with sacrifice and suffering, but with something more, an absolute apocalyptic horror in which nature and war fused into a single mechanism of destruction. In this hell, animals suffered as much as people, if not more. The suffering of mules and horses was beyond counting. The landscape around Ypres was unique, a low-lying region reclaimed from marshland with a high water table crisscrossed by thousands of drainage ditches. The local soil was a sticky, adhesive clay. The catastrophe unfolded in 2 stages. First, the massive opening artillery barrage, over 4 million shells, completely destroyed the drainage system. The ditches were filled in, the land was churned up. Right after the offensive began, abnormally heavy rains set in. The result was that the entire battlefield turned into a vast, endless, gluey bog of liquefied mud, many feet deep, studded with shell holes that filled with water in moments. Even today, standing on that ground, you can feel it pull at your soles. In 1917, it became impassable. The collapse of logistics and desperate measures. And yet, despite these conditions, supplies and equipment had to reach the front. The infantry crouching in shell holes needed food, water, and above all, ammunition. It quickly became obvious that traditional logistics had completely collapsed. Heavy wagons and big draft horses were utterly helpless. They sank at once. Their weight simply pressed them down into the mire, sometimes without a trace. The only possible means of delivery became mules and pack horses. They were lighter, more enduring, and had to carry loads on their backs. Across this morass, engineers tried to lay so-called mule tracks, often just narrow wooden duckboards thrown over the quagmire. Staying on these tracks was a matter of life and death. If an animal or person slipped off, especially in the dark, they were doomed. The bog simply swallowed them. Death in the mud, when rescue is impossible. Photographs and eyewitness accounts from the period defy comprehension. They show mules standing chest-deep in liquid mud, unable to move. When an animal fell into such a trap, soldiers tried desperately to save it. The bond between a driver and his mule was strong. They would spend up to 12 hours in frantic efforts to haul the animal out using ropes, planks, and levers. But most often, it was futile. Passchendaele's mud would not let go. It created a vacuum-like suction. In the end, exhausted and shattered, the soldiers realized there was nothing more to be done. The best they could offer an animal, slowly sinking and suffocating, was to end its suffering. Here a moral barrier loomed. For many soldiers, who often had a deep friendship with their animals, pulling the trigger was beyond the call of duty. It felt personal, like killing a companion. An instruction for mercy, Section 33.3. The command understood this problem. To remove the emotional burden from soldiers and ensure a swift, humane death, as far as possible in those conditions, officers were given clear, technical instructions. In the small 1914 Field Service Pocketbook, every officer carried a directive. Section 33.3 consisted of just 3 lines. Dry, unequivocal directions on how to shoot a horse correctly. Lift the forelock. Place the muzzle of the revolver just below the point where the hair begins to grow, holding it slightly away from the skin. Pulled the trigger. And that was it. Job done. It was an extraordinarily humane method of killing a horse. The bullet entered the brain and caused instantaneous death. Military bureaucracy reduced an act of mercy laden with emotional agony to 3 short technical sentences. Operation Michael, the Spring Offensive, began. It was unlike anything the Allies had seen. Using new stormtrooper infiltration tactics, the Germans broke through British positions and flooded into the rear. A war that had been static for 4 years suddenly became mobile again. The British and French armies found themselves in headlong, chaotic retreat. It was the gravest crisis since 1914. In the chaos, the German spearheads aimed at the single most critical strategic point on the entire front, the city of Amiens. Amiens was not just a city, it was the main railway hub, the Allies' solar plexus, linking the British armies holding the north with the French armies holding the south. Losing Amiens would have split the front, collapsed logistics, and quite possibly lost the war. Morwell Wood, the last line of defense. By the morning of March 30, 1918, advanced German divisions had reached the commanding heights near Morwell Wood, a wooded ridge only 5 miles from Amiens. From there, German artillery could have shelled the railway unobstructed. The situation was catastrophic. There was virtually no defensive line. To stop the Germans, everything to hand was thrown in, and to hand happened to be the Canadian Cavalry Brigade under General Jack Seeley. They were ordered to stop the Germans at any cost. For Seeley, Galloper Jack, this was the moment he had prepared for all his life. He was to lead a cavalry attack against entrenched German infantry with machine guns. It was madness. It was the only hope. Before the charge, someone had to gallop under fire and plant a marker flag, the aiming point for the rest of the brigade. It was a suicide task. Instead of sending someone else, he chose to do it himself. He, the general and warrior, the brigade's talisman. He later wrote, "All my life led to this, and there is no doubt that all of warrior's life led to it as well." They looked death in the face. To beat German machine guns required not only courage, but cunning. The German gunners and riflemen were posted along the forest edge. Seeley was 1.5 miles away. He had to ride along the foot of the slope, using the ground as cover from the killing fire, and then, at the chosen moment, wheel and thunder up the incline toward the corner of the wood. Warriors charge. The Germans were likely stunned to see a single horseman racing straight at them. They opened fire. Men and horses began to drop. But Warrior was unstoppable. There can be no doubt that the sight of a thoroughbred charging full tilt straight at a machine gun nest was terrifying. The horse did not shy. While one of Seeley's men planted the flag, 3 Canadian cavalry regiments were already coming up behind. 1,000 riders, shouting with bared swords and rifles fixed with bayonets, swept onto the hill. The cavalry crashed into the wood. What followed was not elegant combat, but brutal, close-quarters slaughter. It was hand-to-hand fighting. Canadians on horseback slashed and thrust. Others dismounted, grabbed rifles and bayonets, and fought among the trees. The Germans resisted fiercely, but they had not expected such a blow. They were stunned. Slowly, inexorably, the cavalry drove them out of the wood. There was no quarter. By day's end, Mariwell Wood was in Allied hands. It was a turning point not only in the battle, but in the entire war. The German offensive stalled. It was the furthest point the Germans would ever reach on the Western Front, and they were stopped by a cavalry attack. General Seeley and Warrior survived. As the men like to say, the bullet that can kill that horse has not yet been cast, and that day it did not find him. Return to maneuver, the 100 Days Offensive. The immense courage shown at Morwell Wood bore fruit. The momentum shifted. In the summer, after the German offensive finally ran out of steam, the Allies launched their own counterattack, the 100 Days Offensive. At last, the front was broken. New technologies such as tanks and aircraft were used alongside infantry in combined arms operations. But on a battlefield that was open once more, there was still a place for the oldest weapon of war, the horse. The tanks of 1918 were slow, unreliable, and prone to mechanical failure. Aircraft could not hold ground. But the horse had speed and mobility. The trenches lay far behind, and the cavalry had finally returned to its element. In the last 100 days of the war, the cavalry finally did what it had been trained to do for 4 long years. Freed from the mud of the trenches, they pursued retreating Germans across open country. They scouted, skirmished, flanked, cut communications, and spread panic behind enemy lines. Smiler Marshall, an Essex cavalryman who had spent most of the war in the trenches, finally returned to the saddle. He recalled how terrified and exhausted Germans dropped their weapons at the sight of the fast-approaching regiments. As he rode past columns of German prisoners, Marshall admitted he could not resist using the tip of his sword to give them a little prod. Not to kill, but to teach a lesson. It was a dark, petty act of revenge, but it vividly illustrated the mindset of the victors at the end of the most brutal war in history. As a new mobile front line, the cavalry kept up the chase until the armistice of November 11, 1918. The Cost of Victory and the Forgotten Heroes. On November 11, 1918, the guns of the Western Front fell silent. The Great War, the bloodiest slaughter in human history, was over. For millions of soldiers, it meant going home. For the army of horses that had borne the war's immense burden, it marked the beginning of their final tragic chapter. The war's toll on animals was devastating. On the Western Front alone, Britain lost over 250,000 horses to mud and battle, but more than 1 million survived. At the armistice, the British Army still had 750,000 horses under its control. Now the command faced a cold, pragmatic question: what to do with these animals? One might think these animals, having gone through hell and earned the right to return home and live out their days in peace. But reality was different. The army, rapidly demobilizing and turning towards mechanization, could not afford to maintain such a vast number of horses. A brutal sorting began. The army decided to keep only about 25,000 of the youngest, strongest, and healthiest animals for future needs. The fate of the rest was sealed.
Betrayal at the slaughterhouse, horses for the vanquished. What happened next was seen by many soldiers and the British public as an act of dreadful betrayal. Around 85,000 horses, the most war-worn, old, sick, wounded, or lame, were deemed unfit. They were shot and sent to slaughterhouses. Their meat fed the starving populations of France and Belgium, as well as hundreds of thousands of German prisoners of war still held in camps. About 500,000 horses were sold. French and Belgian farmers bought them to rebuild war-shattered agriculture. For many animals requisitioned from farms 4 years ago, it was a return to familiar work, pulling a plow. Perhaps not the worst fate. Only about 60,000 horses were brought back to Britain, where they were sold at public auctions to civilians. Mark Evans, studying archival photographs from this period, was stunned by the evidence of pragmatic cruelty. The photos show not field abattoirs, but industrial-scale processing sites, horses standing in queues for slaughter. It was an inevitable consequence of war, but even then, for many it was hard to accept. As a horse lover, it's hard to swallow, and it must have been very hard to swallow for many people in Britain who donated money, and of course, for the soldiers who worked with those horses. They were their friends as well as their comrades. Looking back a century later, it is impossible to escape the sense of betrayal. These animals, who served their country, worked tirelessly, and were in many ways among the chief reasons for victory, were met with a bullet at the end of the road. Exceptions to the rule: the Old Blacks and Warrior. And yet, amid this vast tragedy, there were symbolic exceptions. Among those who returned to Britain was a team known as the Old Blacks. It was a 6-horse artillery team that had miraculously survived the entire war together, from the first to the last day, all 6 alive. Their story became famous, and they were honored with a solemn task: to draw the gun carriage bearing the body of the unknown soldier to its final resting place in Westminster Abbey. And of course, there was Warrior. By Christmas 1918, he had returned home to the Isle of Wight. Jack Seeley and his faithful horse once again rode together across the chalk hills toward the sea. After all they had witnessed, they remained inseparable for the rest of their lives. They lived astonishingly long lives. In 1938, 20 years after the war, they still appeared together at local events. Seeley was 70, Warrior was 30. As the general's grandson noted, such longevity was almost unheard of, and for a horse that had survived the bloodiest war in history, it was nothing short of impossible. Warrior died in April 1941, at the age of 33. His death was such a significant event that the Times published his obituary. Legacy: indispensable but forgotten. The stories of Warrior and the Old Blacks are exceptions that highlight the tragedy of millions of others. Never again would so many animals suffer on the battlefield. War had become mechanized, and the writing was on the wall. The age of the war horse was over. Yet there is no doubt Britain could not have won the war without them. The Great War, as we remember it, could not have been fought without horses. The hundreds of thousands of animals that died in that conflict are almost forgotten. We rightly honor the soldiers' sacrifices, but the horses, who played an equally vital role, remain in history's shadow. They were indispensable. They hauled the guns that thundered on the Somme. They carried ammunition through the mud of Passchendaele. They bore the cavalrymen who stopped the Germans at Amiens. And they died in slaughterhouses when they were no longer needed. The story of the war horse of the First World War is not only a tale of battles, it is one of logistics, of the bond between man and animal, of incredible endurance, and ultimately, of tragic betrayal. Their story, like that of the countless soldiers who fought beside them, must never be forgotten.